What is going on, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to another edition of the Jays for Days podcast. I'm Josh. He's Josh. We got Jay's Jumpers, Jaron Jackson Jr.'s, John Morant's, Joe Johnson's, Jaw Raffs, of course. We've got Jay's, we got him for days. Josh, how you doing?
It's snowing outside. I'm slightly displeased. Not
I'm kind of into
entirely,
it.
but slightly. It is exciting to see. It's also getting cold. And not exactly a winter person, so
I'm very much into the idea of if it's going to be cold, it's might as well snow. Like there's
that's
nothing.
that's valid.
Like I
Sure.
grew up somewhere where it was capable of getting to 33 degrees, but not consistently capable of getting to 29 or 28. And thus it was just cold and rainy and gray in the winters. And if it's going to be cold, either be cold and sunny, because that's fine with me, or be cold and snow. If you're gonna bring some sort of precipitation with it, I prefer it be snow. But
It is funny how where you grow up changes your thoughts on all of these things.
you're exactly right. I mean, snow is a novelty around here.
Right. And it's more of a hindrance for me.
Right. Where you're from, if people stopped every time it snowed, you never get anything done.
That's correct.
Yeah. Very, and we would get school canceled just for the idea of snow. It didn't even have to snow. Just the prospect of
threat.
maybe it's snowing tomorrow could get school closed. But if it's snowing, that means we're deep into the winter and thus deep or getting deeper into the college basketball schedule. And one of the better weeks of the entire season is wrapping up right about now. It is early on November 26th, early in the afternoon on November 26th. And the Florida Atlantic Owls are 36 seconds away from a just absolute dusting of Virginia Tech. And that was about the only thing that we needed to see happen was the winner of the ESPN Events Invitational, and that's very shortly going to end. So Feast Week is basically in the books, and that means it's time for some winners and losers from a week of college basketball all over the country and all over, the Western Hemisphere, really. Down in the Bahamas and Mexico and Hawaii and in New York City, all over the place, and we'll try to boil it down to some winners and some losers, and talk about what happened this week. Josh, anything else we need to get into before we get into our winners?
Nothing major. Yeah, so we do have a couple games that have not finished yet that we're just choosing to not include in our analysis here, but we have plenty to discuss, so it will be fine.
Yeah, I frankly don't care about the outcome of Texas A&M and Iowa State. I just don't especially care. Texas is playing. I suppose that we'd like for them to take care of Wyoming, but other than that, there's not a ton that could change the list that we have right now. With that being said, Josh, who's your first winner of Feast Week?
To me, there are two very clear ones. The first is Villanova.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure there was a team that has legitimate aspirations of being top 15, possible Final Four, those kind of things, that needed to have a successful tournament more than Villanova. Just based on it hasn't necessarily been great. Obviously, you lost to Penn. We talked about after that game, that's just not a thing that happened under Jay Wright. We talked about this idea of they didn't look like Villanova. Is this really a bigger problem than just last season where some things were kind of strange and you and I were both willing to give Kyle Neptune a pass? Well, they beat Texas Tech, North Carolina, and Memphis. All three of those teams then won their other two games of the tournament. That's helpful. They beat Memphis so badly in the final. I don't know if I've ever seen this. ESPN gave up on the game. Did you see that?
I did not see it, but I was, after seeing the halftime score, was certainly not surprised.
Yeah, it was just funny to me because I had recorded it and I was watching and I went, it didn't finish. What happened? Oh, the other game was starting. I think it was the Baylor-Florida game.
Mhm.
And so they just said, we're no longer, this game is now on ESPNU or something, because obviously the beginning of Baylor and Florida was more interesting than what was happening.
Right.
So that was a real positive. The biggest thing for me, though, is specifically in that Memphis game, and in the first half in particular, since that was when the game was decided, the psychological intimidation part was back. This idea that if you don't show up and play with intensity, if you don't take care of the details, if you don't take care of the basketball, if you don't put in the kind of effort you need to win, you are just not beating Villanova. Their ball, and then it looked like Villanova, right? Ball movement for wide open threes, a bunch of guys knocking them down. They had a couple really nice. I mean, Lance Ware even had a really nice pass. Their defense was spectacular. They were just fundamentally sound, all of the things you expect out of Villanova. So to me, that is the biggest, maybe the biggest development of the week, is the idea that all of a sudden, now it's early. It's not like it was the best competition you could possibly ask for, right? They didn't run through 3 top 11 teams like Purdue. But to go from how I was feeling about Villanova entering this tournament to where I feel now, big, big week for Kyle Neptune.
The biggest thing for me here is momentum. I don't really care about that. You could tell me that the 3 wins they got could get better over the next 4 months. You could tell me that they get worse over the next 4 months. It's not
Right.
really about, like, I'd feel just as strongly about the importance of it, even if it didn't have the Bahamas battle for, the battle for Atlantis tacked on to the side of it. I don't really care that it was a tournament win, but this is only the second time in the Neptune era that Villanova has won 4 or more games in a row. And last year the stretch was Oklahoma, Penn, Boston College, St. Joseph's, and St. John's. I'm not exactly None of those teams jump off the page. And so it is easily the most impressive stretch of the Cal Neptune era. And for the first time in his, year plus as the head coach, there's very real momentum. Maryland, Texas Tech, North Carolina, Memphis. That's the stretch that we're on right now. And we talked about how this was an important season, not necessarily from a will Kyle Neptune be fired at the end of this season or not, but just from a setting the tone when it comes to what the Kyle Neptune era at Villanova is going to be like. And Jay Wright could lose 11 games in a row and nobody would ever be talking about, like, is it time to get rid of Jay Wright? And I know that that's not something that Kyle Neptune can achieve in a year or even, in 2 years, but there's something to be said for a coach that can lose games and can go through rough patches and not have people call for his job immediately. And if Neptune didn't have a good year this year, and of course it's early, they could go on a 10-game losing streak now. I don't that could happen. I would not bet on it after the way they played this past week, but there's very real momentum for the first time since Kyle Neptune took over. And I think, like, as you pointed out all of those other things, but that's I think that's really important for someone like Neptune, who was kind of people were just had their ears perked up when it came to his tenure at Villanova.
And that Maryland game was supposed to be really interesting, and Maryland has just not been as good as they were supposed to be so far.
Right.
So it's not even like that really answered the questions, which is why this tournament was so important. Like you said, not necessarily because you win the tournament, but just you have these opportunities to beat these quality teams, and they did so, generally speaking, pretty convincingly. Yeah, there's just a whole level of confidence in we actually might be really good. Look what we just did. That's the biggest takeaway here. I definitely feel different. Well, I am returning to the confidence level I had previously in this team.
Yeah, I think that's probably the best way to put it. Like, we being the collective college basketball world probably overreacted to Penn a little bit. And it's not like I'm higher on Villanova than I was before the season started, but we're much closer to returning to that spot. And to seeing, how many different ways that Villanova can hurt you, which is what their roster preseason was communicating. Um, Eric Dixon was awesome this week. 21 points, average 21 points and 8 rebounds at the Battle for Atlantis. That's functional for sure. And now they've got plenty of momentum. They've got a couple of testers before the beginning of Big East play. They'll play Kansas State and they'll play UCLA before, at this point, the Big East conference schedule starts in the middle of December. So we're only getting 3 more looks at Villanova before they jump into the gauntlet that will be the Big East this year.
Are they one of your winners as well?
They are indeed one of my winners. Next on my list of winners is Elijah Martin. Elijah Martin, FAU kind of takes care of business in a real way at the ESPN Events Invitational. We just mentioned it at the top of the show. Florida Atlantic 84, Virginia Tech 50. And you could make Florida Atlantic the winner here. I'd have absolutely no issues with that, because if anything else, it gets people off of their backs after a little bit of a lackadaisical start, slow start, whatever you want to call it, to the season. But I specifically point out Elijah Martin because that was kind of the thing that we needed to see change, like, very specifically. Like, it was time for Elijah Martin to get going. His first 3 games of the season, 20 total points, 1 of 10 from 2-point range, 4 of 16 from deep. That's not great. And he completely turned it around this week. At the ESPN Events Invitational, it was 13 points against Butler on not a great shooting percentage, but it was much better than it had been. And then he had 25 points in really his first coming out, party of this season against Texas A&M. He was 4 of 7 from 2-point range, 5 of 12 from the 3-point line, 7 rebounds as well in that one. Easily his best offensive rating of the entire season, and would have been one of the better ones from last year as well. And then in the title game that just wrapped up, he had 17 points, 8 rebounds, 4 assists, 5 of 9 from the field, 3 of 4 from the 3-point line. It's a lot easier for everyone else to get going when someone like Elijah Martin is playing well, and that kind of opens up a lot of things for Florida Atlantic in this way of, like, there are just a lot of guys that are going to beat you. Like, none of these guys are going to end up at the end of the season with, 6 or 7 more points per game than somebody else. But kind of that, all of the weapons that they have, like Golden, of course, Elijah Martin, John L. Davis, Jalen Gaffney, the strength with which they, like, across the board can hurt you is important. And also, when someone like Martin's not playing well, kind of makes that kind of approach a lot weaker. And clearly they're a completely different team when he's playing well.
Yeah. My second one, I cheated a little bit. I made it the AAC as a whole, specifically FAU and Memphis. This idea that you came in, okay, Memphis off to a good start, couple decent wins. Let's see what they're made of against high level opposition, 3 straight games. FAU, right? Bad loss, all this attention. This is one of your opportunities to get some really good wins, because you don't have Houston in the AAC anymore, right? You kind of have each other, and that's about it. And they combined to go 5-1. Memphis, obviously, not a good performance against Villanova, but outside of that, you're picking up ranked wins. And from the FAU standpoint, a lot of what you just said, can you stop the bleeding a little bit? Can you make whatever thoughts people had about that loss maybe a little bit of an overreaction and look like one of the top 15 teams in the country? That's exactly what they did. That's a really good win over a Texas A&M team that didn't have the best week, and obviously still have one more game to play as we're recording, but is a very good basketball team. You blow the doors off of an ACC team in the final. That's always nice. On the Memphis side, I did want to talk about this for a second, because I am very interested in this team, and we haven't really talked about them. Javon Quinterly, Caleb Mills, and David Jones is some kind of trio to have at the mid-major level. I know Memphis doesn't, you can argue whether Memphis operates as a mid-major program. They're kind of in that weird spot where they're not really a mid-major, but they're also not Gonzaga. But that is 3 established high major guys. This is a very, and of course, this is Penny's first talented team, but this is a very, very talented, very experienced team that has been good so far outside of that one Villanova game. So I'm very curious about that, but ultimately, the AAC has 2 teams. Both of them showed up and really helped themselves and the conference as a result with what they did this week.
Yeah, Memphis was on my list of possibilities as well. For me, when it comes to Memphis, it's much more about a finite number of opportunities to get good wins.
Mhm.
They're not, like you mentioned, they're not Gonzaga, so they're not able to schedule the type of non-conference schedule that Mark Few can. And it's solid. I mean, like they'll still play. They're going to play Ole Miss and Texas A&M and Clemson and Virginia before they get to conference play. So there will be opportunities, but ironically, Michigan and Arkansas were 2 of the teams that had like some of the worst weeks of anybody in the country, especially at the high major level. But I expect those teams to still probably end up being solid wins by the end of the season. But if you lose, the first game, and so you're kind of playing teams that don't jump off the page of a resume in any way, then all of a sudden this stretch of Texas A&M, Clemson, and Virginia in particular becomes really, really important to probably go above 500 in those 3 games, because once you get to AAC play, the only team better than 86 at KenPom right now is Florida Atlantic. And there's a lot of not so awesome teams that you have to play in there. And you don't get Florida Atlantic until the very end of the season. They play them twice in the final 4 games of the year. And Memphis from time to time is prone to losing games in the AAC that they shouldn't lose. I mean,
Yep.
they lost to Tulane last year twice. They lost twice to Tulane. And those were other than that, they lost to a decent UCF team and Houston. Those were their only other losses in AAC play. But still, like, you probably shouldn't lose to Tulane. It's not like you're getting a ton of other opportunities when you play in the AAC like you would in a different conference. So that's part of it for me as well. And this is also not something they totally did last year. They kind of got off to a rocky start a year ago in some of their early season tests, and that is not the case this year. Next on my list, let's go with Ohio State. Won the Emerald Coast Classic. It's one of those weeks where it doesn't completely jump off the page outside of Alabama, but they also beat a Santa Clara team that now has wins over Oregon and Stanford on the young season already. Buckeyes are playing much better this year. To start, they're playing better defense. The only loss coming in a competitive game to a Texas A&M team that is top 20 in the country. So not a ton to say specifically here, but Ohio State now up to 25th at KenPom. They were down to 50th after their loss to Texas A&M, so a big jump up there. 18th in offense, 45th in defense. They're shooting the 3 well, like you would expect Ohio State to do, but playing some decent defense, and they have a nice resume at 5-1 for Chris Holtman's teams. Chris Holtman's team 6 games into the season.
And this is another team. I'm glad you chose them because I chose somebody else for my third one. Lots of questions coming into the season, right? I threw them into this whole very interesting storylines in the middle of the Big Ten about questions about coaches and where programs are going and all this stuff. Because this is not a talent issue. Even last season, I still firmly believe in the talent on this team. It just wasn't translating. And so now, like you said, they clearly appear to have figured some things out, or at least at this point in the season have figured some things out and are playing up to their potential. To me, that's what this is. They were always capable of doing this. It just, for whatever reason, last season, it was not working. So of the teams that need to get off to a good start this season and put themselves in good position so that you don't have a bunch of work to do in conference play and you just kind of need to keep the boat afloat, they're up there on that list. And right, just picking up W's against decent teams, getting a win over USC, all of that really helps. No bad losses to speak of so far. Yeah, very good start for the Buckeyes.
They're much better defensively thus far, and it doesn't, and nothing jumps off the page in terms of maybe they're just getting really lucky. It's not like opponents are bottom, outside of the top 300 in the 3-point field goal percentage against the Buckeyes or anything like that. Very middle of the road on a lot of those things, and they're basically right where they were offensively last year at the end of the year, but 60 spots higher in terms of defense. Of course, it'll get more difficult as the season goes on to maintain that spot, especially when you consider last year where they were 12th in defense, 11th in 3-point field goal defense, 10th in 2-point field goal defense in the Big Ten. So that's the real test for Chris Holtman's team, is to win consistently in the Big Ten, where they won only one time between January 5th and February 23rd last year. So we will see how they're up to the test as we get into Big Ten play, but this is a good start for the Buckeyes for sure.
And I misspoke. Sorry. I meant Alabama, because my third winner beat USC. It's another red team. I got them confused. Sure. So yeah, Alabama, always a good win. Definitely. My third winner, Oklahoma. Beat Iowa and USC. Not the most inspiring wins in the world, but you're still undefeated. They got an average of 20.5 points off the bench in the two games. Good balanced scoring from the starting lineup. I believe it was 4 guys in double figures both games. And another one of these teams that could really use a good start, pick up a couple quality wins so that you've got some breathing room in the Big 12, so that you don't feel like you have to win every single home game, or that if you lose to UCF on the road, for example, that might cost you big time. I don't have too much more to say other than that, just because the opposition doesn't really inspire me to believe something totally different about Oklahoma. But plenty of teams had bad weeks here, and this is always a challenging week, and a lot of teams pick up losses, and Oklahoma managed to not do that and pick up a couple quality wins along the way.
One of those teams that you'll scroll through rankings, or you'll scroll through KenPom, or you'll scroll through a conference just to see where teams have began their season, and Oklahoma 4-0, and then you go and look who they played, and they just kind of beat up on a bunch of bad teams. They beat up on Central Michigan, Mississippi Valley State, Texas State, and UT Rio Grande Valley. That's 3 sub 300 KenPom teams and 1 sub 200 KenPom team. So there's only so much you can do to believe in a team, and it can be a downer to then go and play real basketball teams for the first time and kind of get smoked and put in your place. And so Iowa, holding an Iowa team to only 67 points is impressive. Porter Moser's team is 21st at KenPom in defense. Iowa is 15th in offense and has put up 110, 98, 84, 88, and 85 in their other 5 games this year, and the outlier is 67 against Oklahoma. So that's got to mean something. They're playing good defense. They're getting enough offensively and kind of a balanced attack. And as a result, are 6-0. They'll get a couple more tests the next month or so to kind of keep it moving. But unless they stumble in a very real way against Arkansas Pine Bluff, they're gonna head into December an undefeated basketball team.
Yeah, you just didn't know what to expect heading into this week because they hadn't played anybody significant, and so it can go one of two ways. But now all of a sudden, at least, right, they're piquing your interest a little bit to see if they can keep this going.
Indeed. Anybody else that you want to mention in a positive manner, even if it wasn't an official winner, before we move to the loser side of the equation?
The other team I had here is Texas Tech,
Mm-hmm.
another program that coming off of a rough season, lots going on in terms of coaching situation, and they do pick up 2 wins. Now Michigan's in a strange spot, but they do go to a major tournament. They go 2-1. You lose to the team that won the championship in that tournament. Not the end of the world. Oklahoma, to me, just walking away without a loss and probably having the better wins. Ultimately, that's why I went with the Sooners as my third winner, but Texas Tech also had a good week.
Yeah. Respect to the Red Raiders. All right, let's talk losers. Who's up first?
I sort of cheated again, but I just went with the Big Ten.
Okay.
And we decided we're excluding all of the Maui stuff we had already talked about. So that moves Purdue. And Ohio State is the other team I wanted to make as an exception to this.
Mm-hmm.
I did have a note there, but we already talked about them as a winner. They obviously had a really good week. Some of the other highlights for the Big Ten included Michigan going 1-2 and not being able to guard anybody.
Correct.
Penn State going 1-2 and losing to the team it just took the coach and best player of. Iowa 1-1, which is fine, but not inspiring. Like you said, Oklahoma figured out how to stop them offensively. And then Michigan State's got this chance to beat Arizona to get the signature win, and that doesn't happen either. You know, all of these teams that were supposed to be in the conversation, maybe making this interesting with Purdue, and it's not really happening for any of them right now, which makes this really interesting from Ohio State's standpoint of, are they going to be able to make a run at it, a top 4 finish in the Big Ten?
Mm-hmm.
We're a long way from that. Obviously, the season is very young still, but it just feels like Purdue is miles ahead of everybody else at this point.
So let's play this game. Michigan is one of my losers, so you're spot on with the Big Ten in general, but Michigan, the book is out on Michigan, and they have 2 players that they can rely on in Doug McDaniel and Olivia Kamwa. And if those 2 guys aren't some variation of like 40 points, 15 rebounds, and 10 assists between the 2 of them, at least that's what it feels like. They're not going to beat very many good teams. They're just not. They just don't defend anybody. Let's play this game. Let's assume that we'll be modest and say Purdue goes 15-5 and wins the Big Ten. Let's just say 15-5. How many Big Ten conference games are you gonna have to win to get at least a share of second place? If I made you pick right now,
say 13.
Okay. It's one of those cases where 13 low key feels like a lot and 12 doesn't feel like enough.
Right. Yeah, the over-under is definitely 12.5.
I think so.
Because, Illinois could go on a run where they win 5 straight. Michigan State could just win 13 or 14 and start figuring things out and look like Michigan State by March going into the Big Ten tournament. Maybe Ohio State is legit. Maybe Michigan figures out how to guard people. Maybe Maryland pulls it together. IU could hypothetically get into that 11, 12, 13, maybe.
IU is uninspiring in every single way possible right now. But so is kind of everybody else.
Right. That's really the problem is, okay, so who is it?
So
I still think Michigan State is there.
So let me offer you this. Last year, that's exactly what happened. Purdue was obviously the best team in the Big Ten. They finished 15-5, won the Big Ten by 3 games. Indiana, a 4 seed in the tournament, 23-12, 12-8 in conference. Is there are you confident that like right this second that Michigan State is definitely better than that Indiana team last year? And I guess without
At
Xavier
this
Johnson,
moment in time,
it probably without Xavier Johnson, it probably is. But like right this
yes.
second, are you for sure?
If they played today,
Sure. That's fun.
no. Am I more confident that Michigan State is going to be the more dangerous team by the NCAA tournament than Indiana was? Absolutely.
Sure.
That's the difference for me. But right now, yeah, because of the continuity, because of Trace Jackson Davis, I would have no problem making IU the slight favorites if they played.
It's just I think it's interesting because it was already is anybody on the level of Purdue and
Right.
Michigan State being, a top 5 preseason team, that seemed to kind of be the answer. And not only is Michigan State not lived up to that expectation, there hasn't been anybody really fill those shoes, right?
Illinois has been fine.
Right, right. But
Right.
Illinois was always, at least in my mind, pretty clearly a tier, like at least one tier below.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Just in terms of, because I looked at and I really thought there was this group of 4, 5, 6 teams that were going to separate themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And they haven't done a lot of separating so far outside of Illinois, who hasn't really done that much other than just what they're supposed to.
Right. And then lost to Marquette at home. So they haven't really. I mean, sure.
It's what they're supposed to do,
I suppose. But it's not like the one chance they have wins over Eastern Illinois, Oakland, Valpo, Southern, and Western Illinois.
Right.
I'm not exactly any more confident in Illinois because they lost to Marquette at home.
Correct. I'm just not any less confident either.
Sure. It'll be interesting how the Big Ten plays out for sure, because right now it looks like Purdue is going to win that conference by maybe more games than they did last year, which would be impressive for sure. Michigan was on my list. Let's go to, you got anything else on the Big Ten that you wanted to mention?
No, nope, covered it all.
Arkansas is not a very good basketball team right now.
They're also my second loser.
They've dropped from 14th all the way to 51st at KenPom since the beginning of the season. That's impressive. That's tough to do. They were lucky to escape Stanford. The double overtime win is the only win they have. They could be 3-4 and losers of 4 straight instead of 4-3 right now. They just don't do anything well. They're not doing anything well right now. There's nothing to hang their hat on. They don't shoot it awesome. They don't defend at a high level. They don't share the basketball. They're 333rd in assist to field goal made ratio. It's a lot of hero ball. It's just, when you look at their roster, they don't have a lot of guys that are hanging their hat defensively. They have a lot of high volume, me first guards. They don't have anybody, like Anthony Black, like Jordan Walsh, those type of players to kind of balance those kind of things out, because it's not like they didn't have those guys last year. I mean, Devo Davis was there. Ricky Council IV was there. Those are high scoring guards, but they had guys like Anthony Black, like Jordan Walsh, who were really, really important last year on both ends of the floor. They don't have those guys. They replaced them with guys like Caleb Battle, who I'm really not sure, other than scoring points, how he contributes to winning basketball in any way. I've felt that way since he was at Butler and at Temple, and again at Arkansas, that he's just a very one-dimensional player. And if he's not scoring the basketball, and he's scored the basketball fine this year, that's not that he hasn't, but he's not going to do a whole lot to elevate his teammates. And there just isn't really any of that going on for Eric Musselman's team right now. And it was not a good week for the Razorbacks. There's
clearly an Anthony Black sized hole here. That was my biggest takeaway from the week. You talked about the assist to turnover ratio and the fact they don't move the ball. They also had 38 turnovers.
Mm-hmm.
And we're doing fine against North Carolina until they started turning the ball over. And then North Carolina started running. And that was kind of that. And they did they clawed their way back in a little bit. And you mentioned the fact, right, they need double overtime to beat Stanford. And then on top of all of that, Tremont Mark is having the best game of his college career and gets stretchered off the floor after a scary fall.
That doesn't help either.
And I said this when Tremont Mark transferred. I love Tremont Mark. And he was showing you why in that game. North Carolina could not guard him.
Yep.
And so hopefully, I haven't seen too much about his diagnosis or status. Hopefully he is healing and ultimately okay. That was really, really scary to see.
I saw that Jeff Goodman said that he was released from a local hospital and he was able to travel back to Fayetteville with the team when the team was already scheduled to return. So that's good, at least that there was nothing that needed to keep him there longer than that. So that's good, but still, of course, just piling on at this point.
Right. Because they would be nowhere without him.
Right.
From an obviously his own personal health is more important, but just from an on-court standpoint. And then on top of that, like you said, he's not a point guard either. They just don't have anybody that moves the ball. And so I think I'm to the point where I'm just going to stop expecting Arkansas to be good during the regular season. But I have every bit of confidence this is good. They're going to figure this out by March. It's just going to take them the entire season, and then we're going to wake up, and they'll probably be in the Elite Eight again because they are awfully talented.
Here's why I might disagree with you. Who's the defensive foundation of this Arkansas basketball team?
Trevin Brazil.
Is there anybody on the perimeter who has any interest in playing defense?
Yeah, at this point, I can't give you anybody.
Here's what I'm getting to. Since Musselman took over starting in the 1920 season, they were 57th in defensive efficiency that first year, and then they rattled off 10th, 11th, 17th the last 3 years. Right now, they are 56th. We've seen, and the offensive efficiency kind of is in a similar ballpark every year, 43rd, 53rd, 54th.
They're an inherently inefficient offensive team because of the way they play.
Sure. But if you're going to be inefficient offensively, you better be good defensively.
Yeah. I mean, maybe it's Tremont Mark just based off the fact he came from Houston.
Maybe.
That's all I'm gasping at straws here. My thought is more, I guess here's what I'll say to that. My thought is more, I would not be surprised in the least if they have a couple games in the tournament where they just score 85 points. Maybe one time they figured out and have a good defensive performance. And it doesn't necessarily change how you feel about the team, but they just find ways to win because they've got the guards and the offensive firepower to just do what needs to be done in March, even if they're not a complete team. Because that's a very valid point about the defense.
And that's just not why they win in March. They don't have games like that. That's not what they do. They win 71-66 in March. Yep. They last year, the team that blew up offensively was UConn, and they lost 88-65 after winning two very similar 73-63 and 72-71 games. So, they're 162nd in effective field goal percentage. This is all defensively. 222nd in turnover percentage. They don't defend without fouling. They don't guard the 3-point line. Sub 100 and 2-point field goal defense. They got to figure out that end of the floor because they're never going to be efficient enough with the guys that they have, which is fine. But the offense is never going to be something that's going to carry them deep because once every 3 games, they're just not going to be as good offensively as you'd like because it'll just be an off shooting night, and that's just how it's going to work. So if once we see some improvement on that end of the floor, I'll be more inclined to hop back in they'll figure it out, especially once we get to the tournament bandwagon. But if they continue to go the wrong direction defensively, then I'll be concerned for sure.
Yeah. The other part of that is that this is a better offensive team from a pure talent standpoint.
I mean, sure. I'll wait for the numbers to tell me that. But in theory,
yes,
sure.
in terms of the ceiling, right? I'm envisioning this kind of like a North Carolina thing. Now, obviously, part of that was they also made some significant defensive changes, but where it's not that Caleb Love all of a sudden turned into an efficient player. Caleb Love was efficient for an extended period of time, right? And it changed.
Sure.
That's more what I'm thinking this is going to look like if they pull this off. But we gotta, yeah.
And
There's a
both
lot of
of
work
those
to do on the
UNC guards
Mustangs.
would be immediately the two best players on this team, or at least two of the top three, because Davis and Love are better than everybody except for Mark.
That I'll give you that. Yes.
So we'll see. We shall see. I'm disappointed though. This is a team that I picked to go to the Final Four like 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
So I'm disappointed. Who's next for you?
My third one. We're just gonna. Wow, we had a lot of red teams we highlighted here. Let me just tell you about Stanford.
Sure.
Stanford has twice as many losses as they do games against high major opponents.
That's tough.
Yeah. You mentioned the Santa Clara loss, which is not a horrific one, but a game that if you have intentions of making the NCAA tournament, you should be winning. Jared Haas has a singular 20-win season and one finish over 500 in Pac-12 play. If I read those numbers correctly, this is year 8. You have Andrei Stojakovic. And we're already in November here saying things like it took double overtime to beat Stanford. That's not great. That's really all I wanted to say. I just keep wanting this team to be better and just they're not.
What makes this sting so bad is like they were really close to having a totally respectable week. Right? I mean, like you almost beat Arkansas, you only lose to Michigan by 5. Ironically, those are two teams that we've discussed already in this loser segment. So it's not like it would have been crazy awesome if they had won one of those games. But then you just have this incredibly sour taste in your mouth because the week ends with just getting smoked by Northern Iowa, right? You kind of run out of gas. You've had 2 really tough, hard fought. I mean, you've played 10 more minutes of college basketball than Northern Iowa has over the last 2 days prior, right? As a result. And so I'm sure they were out of gas to begin with. And instead of like, and Northern Iowa was fine, top 100 KenPom team. It's not like they lost to the 200th ranked team at KenPom, but you were close to having like a result or two that could be encouraging, and instead you just came up short in those games, and then you got smoked kind of at the end of the week when maybe you were a little checked out on the trip at that point, just to kind of add salt to the wound.
Right. And they're not in a position, and that's maybe ultimately what is the other really disappointing part of this for me, outside of the fact that they were close and competitive those first 2 games. They don't have the luxury of taking games off because they haven't started well and they lost those first 2. Right? You've got to it's not catastrophic to go 1-2 in one of these tournaments, but you got to make sure you don't go 0-3. And to, like you said, to not even show up in a meaningful way in that last game. It's a better Pac-12 too. It's not like there are just 10 plus wins sitting there for you. Now, the flip side is if you have a really good conference performance, then these non-con games don't matter as much. Hypothetically, because you're playing better teams, because Arizona's looked good and UCLA's had some moments, and now UCLA, USC haven't looked quite as good as we thought. So maybe the Pac-12 isn't going to be that good after all. But there's a chance that you can make up for some of this. But at some point, you just got to put W's on the board. And they're coming close against the high major teams they played. That, right, it's one of those, okay, which came first, or which does it say more about? The fact that Stanford couldn't beat these teams, or the fact that these teams nearly lost to Stanford, because all of them are in bad spots right now. But then the other part is, even if you don't win those games, help yourself by getting these top 100-ish Chem Pop wins over the Northern Iowas and Santa Claras of the world, the good quality high major opponents, and they're not doing that either.
Northern Iowa has only beaten one Division I college basketball team this year.
Oh boy.
They have wins, or they're 2-4 with wins over Stanford and Loras.
How do you spell that?
Loras.
Oh.
Loras. Loras.
Never heard of it before.
Yeah, me neither. So, but it has an NR next to their name on KenPom. So that's all I need to know. Yeah, not a great week for not a great week for Stanford, and a guy that's very much coaching for his job right now, and Jared Haas that's about the worst kind of week that could have happened for you. So they're now 3-4 with wins over Eastern Washington, Sacramento State, and Cal State Northridge. Not a ton to show so far, roughly a month into the season. I'm going to go a little less the sky is falling here for my last loser, and more kind of on the, man, they're so close to having an incredible start, and instead it's just kind of been a fine start, and that's the Florida Gators. 4-2. This week they lose to Pitt, or they beat Pitt, excuse me, and they lose to Baylor. And this is kind of, I'm cheating a little bit here because Florida, this is more about their season as a whole thus far than necessarily what happened during Feast Week. But they lose to Baylor 95-91. They beat Pitt 86-71. That's what happened during Feast Week. But they now have wins in 4-2 with wins over Loyola MD, Florida A&M, Florida State, and Pitt, with losses to Virginia and Baylor. And those two losses to Virginia and Baylor are by combined 7 points. They've moved from 40th at KenPom, 41st at KenPom, actually, all the way to 26th. And I just hope because I think the Gators are good. I think they have good basketball players. They have a great backcourt. I think Todd Golden is figuring it out at the high major level. I just hope that we get deep into this season and Florida isn't one of those teams that's like top 35 at KenPom, but their resume is going to like have them sweating deep into the season, because the metrics will tell you that they're playing better than the preseason projections, but they haven't really done a whole lot from a resume perspective yet. Because ultimately, getting one of those wins against Virginia and Baylor, those are the only two teams they've played thus far that I'm really, really confident, if not positive, are going to be NCAA tournament teams. Florida State, maybe. Pitt, maybe. There's a world in which it could happen, but I'll, hold off a little bit on that in terms of whether those teams will end up being NCAA tournament teams. And then you look at the rest of their schedule until they start conference play right after the new year, but it's, Wake Forest, Merrimack, Richmond, East Carolina, Michigan, Grambling State, Quinnipiac. Like we could go until 2024 without Florida beating an NCAA tournament team. Like that could happen. Michigan could, but also if the last week or any indication when it comes to actually good basketball teams, I'm not confident in Michigan's ability to make the tournament. If nothing else, just won't be one of those things that you can kind of base your non-conference resume on, is that, oh, we beat Michigan. I don't think that's going to happen this year. So we could just get to a point where Florida has some nice metrics and they're just going to have a ton of work to do in the SEC once we get to conference play. And they were so close, and they've been so close the last couple weeks to, this could be a 5-1 record with a win over Virginia, and it could pretty easily be a 6-0 record with wins over Virginia and Baylor. And instead it's 4-2 and still kind of searching for a win that you're probably not going to be able to find in terms of kind of the pillar of your resume until you get to SEC play.
This might be one of those teams I end up going to bat for. Its record isn't great, but that just plays good basketball every game and loses to good teams. Yeah, we're going to have to see. But if they go, the flip side to the idea of there aren't a lot of great opportunities left in non-conferences, if they run the table the rest of non-conference, then you're in pretty good position as long as you do what you're supposed to do. You pick up a win against a Kentucky, a Tennessee, somebody in SEC play, you're in pretty good shape. The other part of this I'm interested in is I was not convinced by their ceiling. Clearly, I was wrong because they are playing very well and proving they can be competitive with really good basketball teams. The other part of this that they've struggled with the last couple of seasons is, can you be consistent enough? Can you do what you're supposed to? Because clearly they're going to give themselves opportunities to get these wins. Now, whether they actually get them or not remains to be seen. So far, they're 0 for 2 in their opportunities. But that's what makes a Wake Forest game, a Michigan game, a Richmond game interesting to me is they could very easily win and maybe should win all of them based on what they're doing. At some point, though, as much as I want to just talk about process and how it looks, you do need to win games as well.
The team that kind of came to mind when thinking about this was Providence from a year ago. This is a Providence team that was finished 40th at KenPom, 21-12. They had a stretch where they got really, really close to getting some good wins early in non-con. November 19th, they lost to Miami of Florida. November 20th, they lost a close one to St. Louis. And then on November 30th, they lost to TCU. They then ran the table in December against teams they should have ran the table against. And Florida's remaining schedule is better. Providence ends up 21-12, 40th at KenPom, 13-7 in the Big East, respectable, and they're an 11 seed in the tournament. And there's just not a ton that you can do with an 11 seed in the tournament. You know what I mean? And like, I will not remember the 2023 Providence team as a team that was only good enough to be an 11 seed. Like, that's not really how I remember that team, right? Jared Bynum, Noah Locke, Devin Carter, Bryce Hopkins, a lot of good basketball players. And you look back on the conference schedule and the resume from there, and you're like, oh, okay, like that was a really solid Big East team. But they're an 11 seed. They end up playing a team like Kentucky in the first round, and then you lose in the round of 64, and it's kind of a season that's like, probably feel like we were better than an 11 seed that lost in the first round that year. And I hope that doesn't happen in Florida.
Yeah. Plenty of opportunities still, but
certainly
interesting to keep an eye on.
Certainly. Those were all of mine. Arkansas, we touched on Michigan, and then Florida. What do you have left on your list of losers?
I would like to acknowledge one more thing that occurred. The Creighton Blue Jays had scored 80-plus points in all of their games.
I don't want to talk about it, Josh.
They scored 48 in a 21-point loss to Colorado State. We're just throwing this up. We're just throwing this away and saying it's never going to happen again, right?
Yes, I would love to say that. I would love to say that about the team that I said was going to have the best unit in college basketball, and that being their offense. In a game where they only scored 48 points, and I have people talking about Isaiah Stevens being the best point guard in the country. Very good point guard, very good player, but that's how bad they beat Creighton, is that people launch padded that into, does Colorado State have the best point guard in the entire country?
I think the best point guard in the country might be part of the best offensive unit in the country. Just gonna throw it out there.
The Golden Eagles?
Yeah.
Those two things might have connective tissue.
They might.
Yeah, you might.
Correlation doesn't equal causation, though.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. Yeah, we don't need to talk about that any longer. Do you have another thing you want to talk about? I've got one more thing that I'll throw out there.
I just wanted to own that.
Yeah, okay. The last team I'll throw out there is Oregon. Losses to Santa Clara and losses to Alabama. Neither of those like really make you want to scream and be angry about them, but they just keep getting absolutely decimated by the injury bug. Their big guys are hurt again. And Nate Biddle and N'Faly Dante, both of them, dealing with injuries that will keep them out for multiple weeks. And I'm to the point where I feel bad for Dana Altman. It seems like all of the momentum keeps getting sucked out of that program every single year. And we leave ourselves wondering what in the world happened to Oregon. And they lost 88-82 to a tough Santa Clara team in a game that they didn't have Nate Biddle or N'Faly Dante, and then they lost to Alabama in a competitive, high scoring 99-91 game where they also didn't have N'Faly Dante or Nate Biddle. And it's just kind of like, man, is it ever going to let up for Oregon? Because, with those guys, there's a very real argument that they're 6-0 with a win over Alabama, and there's all kinds of momentum. And instead, feels like it's more of the same from last year, and I'm more just sad for Oregon than anything else.
Yeah, they're another team that I have a hard time believing in just because of what we've seen the past few seasons. This idea that, it's all just going to come together this time, because they looked good on paper the last couple of years too, and it hasn't happened for them.
Mm-hmm.
But also it needs to be acknowledged that this is not just this group of players not delivering. Right. The injuries are a big part of the story here. And obviously that's outside of everybody's control. So there is grace that needs to be extended for that. And hopefully you get your big guys back. The Pac-12 delivers on expectations and has a strong end to non-conference. So you've got plenty of time to make up the ground that you might have lost while they were injured. Hopefully the committee takes into consideration the fact that you didn't have your big guys for these two games, that these, Santa Clara, Alabama continue to perform well, and it's not that big of a deal at the end of the day. We'll have to wait and see, though.
Yeah, last year it was guard health. This year it seems to be big man health, and it's just tough for Dan
and the continuity part of it too, because they are moving guys in and out with the transfer portal, and these are the returners, here are the new pieces we're adding to that. This is why we're excited. They need to be on the floor together for extended periods of time to get the most out of this group, and they just really haven't had that opportunity.
Indeed. Anything else?
Caitlin Clark has another ranked matchup tonight, another Big 12 opponent. I'm curious about that.
There you go.
And should be, after we get through Monday, should be a good week with all of the ACC, SEC games on the men's and women's sides.
Indeed. Please subscribe to the Jason Fridays podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. Return of the Under 8 podcast this week, daily, college basketball podcast. Get you in, get you out. 3 biggest stories. You can subscribe to that on YouTube. Follow us on Twitter. That the show streamed live to our Twitter page as well. So those will resume shortly after getting through the Thanksgiving holiday. So be on the lookout for that, and we will see you very soon. Thank you so much for listening to this edition of the Jays for Days podcast. I'm Josh. He's Josh, and we will see you later.